Welcome to Examined Live. Today I talk with my brother Simon, a computer programmer and deep thinker. He went from Christian to atheist. I encourage you to come curious, come willing to learn, come as you are. Thank you, first of all, for taking some time to have, I think, maybe a trepidatious, if not brave, conversation about a big issue. I think it's an issue a lot of us tiptoe around. And I don't know the best place when we're biting off something this big, where to begin, in terms of open, curious discussion, like how to really best create that. I suppose I'll get better at that at some point, but I want to give a holistic picture and then maybe explore where things are with you right now. And someone gave me a good piece of advice: when you're trying to bite off something really big, start with something very small. So start with a moment. And I thought about this a lot and started with the moment that you and I were running. And you said something startling to me. We had finished up the turkey trot one year and we were heading up to Thanksgiving dinner, and we were talking about the loss of faith. And I said something about how our sister was on a precipice. And you said, we actually all are. And I remember that sort of gobsmacking me. Do you remember that moment?
I have no memory of that.
Okay. All right. Well, it's funny how we hit each other at different times and things like line in and click. Um, the reason I think I thought of that is because I look back at that moment now and realize that you might have already started in a process of questioning your faith. So, will you share a little bit, since that's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight? That's the topic. And it's not the only topic I like to talk about, but it's the topic that I think I want to do more open, curious conversations around, because I think I have growth that I need to do. So I want to talk about where you are, ask where you are, when it comes to this idea of faith and belief, since we're all raised to be very strong believers.
You want to ask where I'm at now or where I started going into the space where I'm at now? I think you
Let's
started to kind of ask one of those and then switched it.
Okay, fair enough. Let's start with where you are now, and then
Okay.
we will go back.
So at present, I consider myself an atheist. Um, you know, I think when I, first lost my faith, um, I really wanted to still believe. I just couldn't anymore. And so I wanted to be an agnostic, but I couldn't bring myself to be there, you know, to say, I don't think I have enough evidence either way. That, you know, I think that in a sense, I'm an agnostic in the sense that, um, you know, I haven't seen evidence that I now consider compelling as to God's existence, but I would still kind of love for some parts of what I learned about in religion to be true. There's a lot of parts actually of religion that I would love to be true. And if I was presented with evidence of it, it would sway me almost right away because I can't help but wanting these stories. We always want the world to be full of goodness and righteousness. If you listen to a story where that's not the arc of the story over the course of the story, you hate it. It may feel real, but you'll be extremely depressed by the time you're done. And we can't survive like that. And I can't survive like that either. I want there to be something. I just, I don't know what shape it could take that would fit the available evidence.
Okay. That's really interesting. What parts do you want to be true? You said the good the good and the righteous. Is that what you meant? Or is there more that you would want to be true?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly want for there to be really good reasons why you'll be rewarded for being fair and altruistic and just in this life. I want for good to win in the end, in the ultimate end, you know? Um, and I want for, and I still think that might be possible even without a God, you know, that good could win. I just don't think it's a foregone conclusion, you know, and then I want for people to get what they deserve um, at the end of it all, you know, because the lack of justice hurts, you know. People get hurt and they shouldn't be able to get away with that. At some point, everyone should find out. Like, they don't even have to be hurt back, but they should at least find out that they were wrong and they should be confronted with that reality.
Hmm. I kind of like that thought as a person of faith because I think if I could imagine the most gratifying version of the judgment seat, and I really, really struggle, I'm definitely in a camp that questions the whole idea of hell. Um, well, I don't even question it. That ship has sailed. Um, that's a whole other conversation. But I do have that sense of I don't have a retributive sense of justice, but a sense of like it hurts me to see people do the horrible things they do. And I so resonate with that. And if they could be made to understand the depth and breadth of the pain that they cause other people, that would be a intense level of judgment.
Yeah, it would make the world feel more right.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up with this question. How did you get here?
How did I get to not believing that that's the way the world is?
Yeah, there's a lot of prongs, right? We just opened up like the wheel of time, so to speak,
Okay.
because we can talk about like how you got to the sense of like, this is what my version of judgment would be. How did I get to the sense that there's not a God really doing these things? How did I get to the sense that maybe there's not a moral arc to the universe? Um, or if there is a moral arc to the universe, it doesn't require a God. So we just opened up a whole can of worms. So all of those things are on the table. We're going to have to pick a direction for the moment.
All right. Well, from a personal story standpoint, you know, I think really it starts with listening to podcasts by people who were atheists, who were deliberately, I think, taking pot shots at the concept of deism, right? Of there being a spirit world and a physical world. And in some of those cases, it was they really wanted people to stop believing that stuff. And in other cases, it was they just were cynics. They were pointing out, you know, like you really should follow evidence, and there's not evidence, you know. And so it was a combination. It wasn't overt evangelism of atheism really that persuaded me, right? Like I don't think that that could persuade me, starting from where I started from, right, which was a lot of faith and belief in this God that I viewed as good, you know. Um, it was let me point out one of the first big cracks in my faith uh, was listening to the New Testament parable about the sower, you know, who sows the seeds on all the different ground, and some of it falls, you know, on the storm, on you know, on the rocky ground, and some of it falls on good soil. And the point of that being that unless you are able to really grow the faith and spread the seed, um, you aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing as a Christian. You are unproductive soil. And it dawned on me after a while, I am a terrible evangelist. And the reason that I am a terrible evangelist, like I tried, but I couldn't bring myself to say something that I couldn't prove was true. And you can't prove that God is true. Like that's sort of the whole point of faith, right? So I'm stuck in this place where I can't be a good Christian because I'm asking people to believe, good Christian by the definition of that parable, because I'm asking people to believe something without evidence. And I can't, like, if people want to believe something without evidence, I'm happy to tell them why they should, but I can't try to persuade them in any strong way to believe without evidence because that is how I am persuaded is by evidence. The only reason, and eventually it dawned on me that the reason that I believe in God in the first place is because I like the story and it was the one that was told to me growing up, but not necessarily because I had any evidence of it.
Mhm.
And I thought I did. I thought I had evidence. I thought I had these stories. We do these testimonies as children and as teenagers and as adults. You're asked to give your testimony and you're asked to provide specific examples of when God intervened in your life.
Mm.
And you're looking at these places where God, where you have these stories,
Yeah.
where God intervened in your life. And you realize there's no real difference between these times that God chose to intervene and the times that God chose not to intervene. Like, you didn't do things differently in any meaningful way that you can recreate to make God intervene. So either he's just acting completely independent of you, which is the general Christian view, or he's not there and you're just fooling yourself, which is the general atheist point of view. And so after a long time of listening to these atheists kind of take pot shots at my faith, um, it really was, and I always, it was when Trump was elected and I saw so many people I rejoicing in this, right? Like like turning their back on their principles. And that really wasn't enough to convince me on its own, right?
Right.
It didn't break my faith that Donald Trump got elected. What it did was it caused me to say, how can so many Christians, so many people that I believe in, have gotten this so wrong? And so I started looking into science more, psychology more, particularly science like psychology and neuroscience,
Mhm.
and trying to understand people from that perspective of what have we been able to find that is recreatable? How are people getting confused at mass scale? And as I looked into that more and more, and I learned the patterns by which people could deceive themselves, which is really, you know, that is the atheist view of religion. Religion is primarily a process of deceiving yourself. That um, that I learned every major piece of evidence that I have for God, all these testimonies that I've put together of His interaction in my life, they fall well within the bounds of ways that people can deceive themselves.
Can you give me a good example of that? Like from a piece of science. I mean, I just finished Keith Payne's How Minds Change and David McElhaney's like Good Reasonable People. So both of these are not people of faith, grew up in faith communities, left those faith communities, working in that world of exactly what you're talking about, neurological science and why people do what they do. What did you read? And then can you connect it to a thing where you were like, that principle is where I was deluding myself?
So one of the more important things that I read was I started to read about um, split brain patients, right? There was a point in time
Okay.
in the 1950s or 60s, I don't know if you've heard of this, of
Yeah, where the
where they were,
corpus callosum.
yeah, they were trying to uh, cure epilepsy.
Right.
And so they severed the connections between the hemispheres of the brain. And what they realized was that the language center of your brain would continue to make up stories for why the other half of your brain was doing what it was doing, even when it had no information at all about why it was doing what it was doing. So they would flash these different pictures to both sides of your brain, to each of your eyeballs, each of which is connected to a different half of your brain.
Mhm.
And then they would ask you to take an action based on these pictures that you had seen. And then when you're building sentences to output them, like your brain can actually understand language in both sides of your brain, but it generally tends to build um, language in your left hemisphere.
Right.
Like you're building your sentences from your left hemisphere. And so what they realized was that that piece of your brain that does that building, is really a rationalizer, not the conscious part of your brain. The conscious part of your brain, the piece that you can put into words, is its purpose is not to make decisions. It is not the highest order piece of your mind. Its purpose is to convince other people that you had just cause for what you were doing. And so they did these experiments, and people would just they couldn't understand what was doing what they're why they were doing what they were doing, but they would make up something that's so smoothly. And it dawned on me that what I had learned about lies and truth, in religion, that lies were from Satan, and that um, once you are of God and His Spirit lives in you, and then you become whole with the truth. Like this whole model of how a human works isn't an accurate model at all, right? A human is a brain, which is really, if you think of it, like the way that it actually works is a ton of little brains. They're all connected and all talking to each other. And all together, they make a group decision. And then the rational part of your mind is there to try and come up with a reason for it. And
So are you saying
and that
we have a self-justifying part of ourselves? We have a narrative brain, a self-justifying brain.
the narrative brain is the self-justifying brain. That's what I'm saying. That's
Okay.
what that's what the science kind of showed. And the case was made pretty strongly. And I was like, that helps me to understand myself so much better than I had ever done through the, good and bad, good and evil kind of construct of Satan trying to convince you to do one thing and you trying to do the other thing. Like,
Okay.
like it is just, fundamentally different from this construct of, of the religious perspective.
Okay. Yeah. I'm this is throwing me back to sort of like being in the evangelical world, which I'm a little removed from. Um, and I'm not saying that there aren't really valid points there. It's just a perspective that doesn't have a lot of traction theologically where I've been for the last couple of decades. Um, there's a it has some traction. I'm not denying that, but it just doesn't have as much traction um in that world. So this is this is good. This is pushing me outside of my usual boundaries. So let me go back to this question fundamentally. You read the science and then you
Yep.
started to see situations where you were doing this. Like, oh, this is the principle, the science is proven, and here is where I am deluding myself. Can you give me an example of that? Like kind of a just a something as concrete as you can possibly come up with.
Ooh, that's a good question. Of a place where I was deluding myself.
Mhm.
Um, uh, yeah, that's really asking me to be raw there. And I tend not to hold on to those kinds of things because I don't inspect them much, you know?
Okay.
Um, I, so not specifically to the, well, I mean, specifically to the lying thing, right? Like I lie all the time, right? Like when I get worried, I don't do, like when I think I'm in danger, I don't do what I know I should and come clean at the first opportunity, you know? I do that if I think I don't have a choice. And that is also, science shows, even among birds and people. This is fascinating because there are big groups of birds that live in these very social hierarchies, you know? Um, and they show the same patterns. When they know that someone is watching, then their honesty increases. And when they know that no one is watching, their honesty plummets, right? Like they will attempt to convince everyone. Like if bird studies are fascinating because I like the removal of the human element from it
Okay.
because it applies so well to well, I mean, animal studies are fascinating in general, not
They
necessarily
are,
just
but you use the term honesty, and it's really hard because that's kind of anthropomorphizing them, isn't it, a little bit?
yeah, and I think it's fair. But anyway, so you have these birds that live in large social clusters. They need to show that they are taking the good of the group into account when they take actions, right? So altruism, right, is a is a status signal with these birds that the birds that are more fair, you know, promote a better society, you know, among the birds, help the flock survive and, you know, recreate. So
Okay.
if they come across a cache of food and the bird notices that it's alone when it comes across that cache of food, it will eat as much as it wants and then take a small amount back to the flock. And or sometimes it will hide some of what it finds and then bring back the flock to you know, to find a smaller stash. But if it if somebody else is watching it, you know, then or another bird, you know, from its flock is watching it, then it's much more likely to share everything equally. You know, the social implication of not being altruistic is not based whether on what the right thing to do is. It's based on what they can get away with, where they know that they need to show that they need to appear to be altruistic. Um, but if they can get away with not being altruistic, they totally will.
Okay, so
And
I have a lot of questions about that I think we're over anthropomorphizing. For instance, we're assuming that the bird isn't reminded of the greater need as opposed to because altruism is again, that's like a higher order thinking, right? As opposed to having a physical reminder there's a greater need, like there's a need over here. And oh yeah, there's another bird hungrily staring at me or something like that. Like how do we know that their altruism is the motive? And I know I'm getting in the way. I'm really sorry about this.
no, you're right. You're making a fair point, I think, if there wasn't ample evidence of humans doing the exact same thing. I think that's the part where it gets interesting, is that
Okay.
when you show humans behave in exactly the same way as birds in these ways, you start to recognize that some of these, you know, hypersocial constructs that are burned into our brains are not uh, they're just evolution. Evolution built these things that look so recognizable to us that we can clearly see those same patterns in humans. It starts to it starts to make sense that what's happened here is that evolution has decided has honed social organisms to kind of follow these same patterns, and that there's
Okay.
no way that we could have become as social a species as we are without having burned some of these things into instinct in the same way, you know, and
So you
that it
don't think
doesn't.
evolution is like a tension between self-preservation and group preservation?
It is absolutely is. The point is that these rules by which we live, but which we call the spiritual rules, right? That they are almost directly derived from that tension,
Hmm.
um, and not necessarily like a God-given set of rules, right? We added the God after based on what was already burned into our brains as instinctual.
So do you think this is where I'm trying to draw a line here, and you correct me or disagree with me. You're trying to draw a line between what we see in pattern behavior in other species is applicable to what we see in evolutionary pattern behavior in the humans. And then we, because we're a higher order species, created a narrative.
Because we have the ability to add causes on top of
Why did
the
we do that?
behaviors, because the best guess that we have at the moment, right,
Okay.
is that we once we learned language, once we had the ability to speak abstractly, it hypercharged our need to justify ourselves in our groups, to show that we were acting out of altruistic motives.
Interesting. Okay. So that was one of the really persuasive things that led you to come to this idea that maybe this whole narrative around an idea of a God is one that we've constructed um, to justify our own behaviors and our inability to balance self-preservation and the greater good.
I wouldn't say inability to justify those, right? Like a lot of like a lot of the spiritual discipline is the, less selfish side of all of those things, right? It's the justification of our altruism. Um, but we fit a pattern onto that. Um, and we had to keep refining that pattern to match better and better, as best as we could, to the template that is burned into our instincts through evolution. So we keep having to better and better try and like consolidate that pattern that's in our minds into a framework, into a theology or a philosophy that maps to our intuition. Um, and we're still going through that process. Whether you are an atheist or a theist, you are never going to be able to, the pattern of that is very complex, right? There are times at which it's better to do the selfish thing because God is telling me that I need to be preserved so that I can keep carrying his light to the nations, you know? And whatever story you need to tell yourself, right? Whatever story, you know,
Mm.
gets you to the point where you can keep pushing forward, you take these actions and then later people can argue whether that was really necessary or God would have intervened or, um, it was unnecessary and that was just a moment of weakness in your life. Like we have these arguments looking through these stories where we see these people take these selfish actions in the Bible, and we
Yeah.
say that was unnecessary. God would have triumphed regardless. But we don't know that, like it's very possible that a person's selfishness was the necessary mechanism by which they survived the events of a few hours here or there, in different parts of their lives that was necessary for them to be able to then try to reimpose altruism afterwards, you know?
So it sounds to me like at the end, like the big thing that you're framing this through this lens of like that we have this narrative because we have this tension of something about altruism keeps coming up in this conversation. Other people will talk about morals or like what is the ethical framework. I was just listening to a podcast about spiritual care for atheists last week on the plane back from Utah. Um, so the question there is a sense of there's a moral framework that atheists can apply to the world. And it is connected to this idea of what makes us or what we're struggling with is altruism.
Yeah, I do use the term altruism kind of roughly here as a stand-in for a huge, set of less selfish motivations,
Okay.
like it's a tension between the necessary social life and the necessary personal, between your individual survival and your group survival is I think is what you said before. There is that tension and you have to work with that. And altruism is not always the best way to describe that, right? Because sometimes it's our group versus some other group, and altruism would say, who cares which group wins? And, that's not the story of the Bible. That's not the story of morality. When I'm using it in this context, I really don't mean all of humanity. I really mean your group, um, to whatever group you're ascribing yourself to at the moment.
That's what's interesting about, I think it's Good Reasonable People where, or maybe it's How Minds Change. Both of them I read right back to back, so bear with me here. But they talked about how we end up making decisions about what is right and what is moral around our affinity group. And that need to fit into the interdependent, have a place in a group of people, which is our interdependence urge, as I interpret it, makes us justify behaviors that everybody else looks at and goes, that's just not justifiable. Like you're making irrational leaps in your thinking. And I think it's very interesting because it goes back to some of what you're talking about, where as evolutionary beings, we have an innate need for self-preservation and see ourselves as an isolated creature. And we are also completely interdependent. And when I studied linguistics, it's shocking how we would not have language centers of our brains if we were not completely interdependent human beings. Like the development of the language skills across all of humanity, being able to creatively put sentences together and do and create the centers of our brain to create the ability to follow that language's rules, even though languages have massively different rules across the world, is is a wonder, literally. But it has to do with interdependence. And so it left me years later thinking about all of the philosopher linguists in the world, and how they've tried to grapple with that exact thing of like, I am an independent human being, but I am also part of a whole. And where do those two things come together? And we use the term altruism, we use the term morality in a lot of spaces because that's about the social contract. What do I owe to the other as opposed to just following my completely self-oriented instincts, right?
Yep.
And then we bring the God piece into it. And we say the God piece is the part where we create a narrative that helps us behave better in relationship to the other. Am I communicating something that resonates or you disagree with?
No, I agree with that. I think the best understanding that we have of where like the modern conception of God comes from was that you needed like if you look at the earliest societies or the hunter-gatherer societies, right? Their gods aren't good. They have gods. They needed to ascribe some cause to things they didn't understand. Um, but they're not good. They're capricious and completely uncontrollable. Like you couldn't contain what they would do. And the point at which you start seeing God being singular and good, right, is when you started needing to coordinate huge groups of people across large areas, right? And before that point, the capricious gods were something that you would sacrifice to in order to try and get the best possible outcome for your crop this year or whatever, right? But once you start interacting in a super society, right? So that's a society. The pantheon supports the society of, hey, we want to make sure that we're all good with, Zeus this year or Poseidon or Athena, whatever, right? I need a society to kind of keep us on track from that. But once I start needing huge trade networks going across the world, then I need to believe in a God who punishes evil and who rewards good across the entire world. And I need lots of people to believe in it in order for this construct to actually start being helpful. And then you start seeing evangelism because that's really what makes it work. You have to have a singular good God across a large, you know, group of people that are going to interact much more infrequently and across larger geographical boundaries and much more spread out social networks.
Do you see that in, you just brought a very Greek slash Roman view of the world, but can we apply that when we start to look at other larger cultures in the East? Is that model of thinking equally applicable?
So by the time, by the present time, as far as I know, right, like we aren't aware of what presaged Buddhism and Confucianism and the
Hinduism.
other and Hinduism, um, where Hinduism had largely become about at some point, you know, doing right action. So it was no longer it wasn't a singular God, but it was still there was very much a right and wrong kind of moralistic non-capriciousness, like morality had become a big part of it. Um, and Buddhism, obviously, huge amount of morality is a big part of it. The the death of desire itself, or the getting away from desire itself. I won't claim to be a super expert on all these things, but I don't know what came before in Eastern religions. I know, um, from my understanding of, you know, the tribal religions of the Americas, which I know a little bit more about, and Viking Norse mythology, like that was all still that same capriciousness. The gods were not necessarily good. They would kind of maybe sometimes direct you towards certain actions, and you tried not to anger them with certain things, but these were not necessarily uh, large moral constructs. They were, you know, in some cases, small moral constructs and the need for sacrifice and honor.
Okay. So we're really tackling it. What's interesting about this conversation is I think both you and I really love to like learn about these things and then try to fit them into a framework we can think about. but in a lot of ways, there are specialists who are way better at this than us. And they know
Right. Yeah.
more, right?
I know almost nothing about Eastern religion, you know.
And so we find ourselves trying to grapple with the big ideas and sort them out and as they apply to our own understanding of faith. And that's really what lest we lose sight of what the real conversation, like the direction of the conversation for the sake of anybody else listening is or reading is it's about what do we do when we learn these things and they displace our certainties in the world. So we've talked just to, and I'm gonna do a horrible recap because we've actually already like ranged pretty far. Oh, we've talked about the idea of narrative. We've talked about the evolutionary ideas. We've talked about, like this, maybe even the evolution of the notion of what a God is, and the need for that. What were some of the other things that caused you to say, I don't know that I can believe in this idea of God anymore, that moved you from a person certain of being a Christian to a person who is agnostic to a person who is atheist? This is not the end of our rich discussion about belief. Join us for part 2. In the meantime, if you like what you hear, consider subscribing to Examined and joining the conversation, where I aim to help us think about our thinking, why and how we come to our assumptions, and to help us have more open and curious conversations on hard topics.